Hi guys, welcome to the video and welcome to TrueEarth Great Britain South for X-Plane 11. My word, what a mouthful. Now, this is by ORBX, recently released a few weeks ago, and I was at the Flight Sim show at Cosford when I first saw it in real life, and it was very nice actually to look at. And I looked at it, I thought, you know what, it's a decent sized area that they've covered, it's a decent looking product, and it's a decent looking price. So yeah, why not? Let's have a look at that and maybe do a review of a piece of scenery for a change. Now, I've used ORBX products before, and notably I do own ORBX England, EU England, as part of the various packages that I've bought off them over the years. Now, this was quite revolutionary in my eyes when it came out, because in effect what it did was it brought visually viable or realistic scenery that was specific to an area right into the sim. So roads, rivers, railways, towns, lakes, hills, etc. They were all there. Key points were put in as well. The only thing, as far as I'm aware, is that obviously because it's not photorealistic scenery, things like hedgerows might not be quite perfect, but fundamentally as a representation of the countryside it was really good, because actually you took off and you flew over what looked like something that you were familiar with. You know, if you've flown over England, you would fly over this and you go, yeah, it's a relatively decent representation. Did have its limits. You know, that shows how old it is, that the scenery here is kind of just like chopped up, with houses going just under the tree line here, etc. So looking into the distance, it was viable, it was good, it was certainly good in its day, but obviously from ORBX's approach here, calling it TrueEarth, they obviously think that this is the next generation, as their strapline beneath says. Now, I'm not going to refer any more to P3D, FSX or any of that, because it's not pertinent. This is for the person who owns X-Plane, has the default scenery and wants to do something about it, or potentially has self-generated photorealistic scenery and wants to look at this as an alternative. And in effect that's two different directions. So the first direction is, I have default scenery, I want to look at this and say, if I buy it, what's going to be the impact in terms of the aesthetics of the sim, and what's going to be the impact in terms of the performance of the sim. Because the difficulty is that we have people who sim on a vast range of machines, and I have what I would term as a mid-range machine. It's by no means a brute. Those above me in that sort of power world of exorbitantly priced PCs, they will probably have absolutely no qualms running this whilst calculating the trajectory of the moon if it would be hit by an asteroid. I don't know, but their computers are, you know, it's the kind of thing that I could furnish my house with some of the cost of those computers. At the other end of the scale, you've got people who might be using computers 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, you know, and still trying to run current generation stuff. Now, X-Plane 11 I've found it to be generally quite good with performance, so I'd like to think that the TrueEarth isn't going to have too much of an impact. And that's why I'm talking to you from the web page at the moment, is that I haven't actually installed it. Because what I'm going to do with the video is as follows. We're going to have a brief look at a couple of areas. What I'll do actually is I'll chop it together accordingly. What I'll do is I'll have a look at 2 or 3 areas on the default scenery, areas where I would expect to see either a significant change in it, areas where I have knowledge of that area, and areas which I think are potentially underrepresented in terms of default sceneries and even add-on sceneries. And I say that because there's a lot of places where there's just no add-on scenery available for some of these places. I mean, the scenery ironically available for, I think it's Predanek, which is the satellite airfield to the military airfield at Culdrose. And ironically, I've seen scenery for Predanek, but not Culdrose, which is weird because actually most of the flying takes place out of Culdrose. But that's by the by. But fundamentally, what we're going to do is we're going to do it that way. I'll have a look at the default, then we'll have a look at what the TrueEarth brings as a change. One of the things I'm also, if I remember, going to have a look at is high speed. And I mention that for a reason. This scenery here, the ORBX England, and the scenery that I've used previously in P3D, for example, up to version 3, I haven't really tried it much in version 4. But one of the things that, if you really want to give your scenery a hard time, you fly low and fast. So by flying low, you force it to have a lot of detail, and by flying fast, you force it to load quickly. So taking a fast jet low level across even, you know, a relatively decent performing PC, your scenery is going to start heaving its guts up and wondering what the heck's going on in terms of how to keep up with you. So one of the things that I found is that even with modest settings on my machine, I could really cause rack and ruin at low level messing around in places like England, because if I went too fast or I had the settings just wrong, I could in effect outpace the sim, which is always a bad thing. Very dependent on what you're running in the background, of course, and that was 32-bit. So I'm not convinced that I would have the same problems running at 64-bit. But at the end of the day, this isn't a comparison between P3D and X-Plane 11. This product is not available for P3D at the moment, and therefore there's no point doing a comparison. So this is purely, what is this going to have as an impact on my X-Plane 11? Now, obviously, I'm looking at it from the direction of going from default scenery to this. There is another potential path, is in that one of the things that's really popular with a core group of people is to generate their own scenery for X-Plane 11 using satellite imagery. Now, there's an awful lot of it. There's tools out there that can help you do it fairly quickly. It can become very convincing. It's very high quality. And it really, actually, it's all just down to how much effort you put in. But there are people out there and guys out there who generate absolutely astonishing 3D scenery with photoreal imagery, so that ultimately you get a couple of 100 feet up, a couple of 1,000 feet up, and it just looks absolutely gobsmacking. And I suppose this is the other angle you could come at this with, is that they invest a lot of time and effort in generating that scenery. Is this something where they might alternately go, you know what, actually this is quite good, and I'm willing to pay the price? And the price isn't earth-shattering. I mean, at the end of the day, these prices are dependent on how much you want to fly that piece of scenery. However, the critical thing for me is that if you go and buy absolutely every piece of scenery out there under the world, you might as well just, you know, go and buy a plane, because it's probably going to be cheaper. Can this have a representation for me of the outside world? But there is one key thing within all of this, and it is epitomised by this image here. Scenery like this, for me, is most beneficial to a VFR flyer. Not somebody who's looking out the window going, "Oh, isn't that pretty?" but somebody who's actually doing PPL style flying, where they're flying from A to B, they've got their nav card or whatever it is, and they're looking to visually navigate. I'm not on about using GPS and looking out the window. I'm looking at, you know, turning on time over that town, setting a heading of this with a wind of that, expecting to be at that position at X number of minutes time. Now, if you're practicing for your PPL, there is nothing more valuable than being able to practice that route and visualizing that route on your home computer. And for me, that is potentially an area for this where I would be looking at it going, okay, you know, show me how good you are. Show me that if I am a private pilot in the south of England, or the south of Britain, I should say, I can jump in this sim and practice tomorrow's navigation route. And know that the references that I see here will be what's on the real ground. Now, that in part is automatically given by the fact they use photo imagery and photorealistic scenery. So as long as it was there in the photograph, it will be there in the 2D image. The question mark we have is that, you know, a 2D image is no good at a slant view. So if you're, you know, let's say this is the ground. In fact, draw a line here where the mouse is. That's the ground. If you're above it and looking down, it's very easy to see the sort of imagery, and it's great for that. If you're much lower at level and you're looking at a very low angle at the scenery, it will appear very different. And so that's one of the areas that I think is going to be interesting. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to fire up the default scenery in the sim. We'll have a quick look at that. It's not going to be particularly stupendous, but what it's going to do is it's going to set our benchmark to then compare against. Right, so welcome to Coventry. As you see, I've got the frame rate counters up here in terms of running along, and they're trickling along nicely, 45 odd frames per second, something like that, which is quite nice. Now this is the Dreamfoil Bell 407 that we're going to use as part of this, because at the end of the day, one of the things I consider, it's not just about looking pretty as a picture, it's about what it's like when you're flying around it as well. So we'll have a look at that. But one of the things we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the impact on an area where there's an airfield. Now Coventry isn't a massive airfield, it's not particularly well known, it's tucked away in the shadow of Birmingham Airport. And I'm not sure if East Mid's, one of my other favourite regional airports, is covered by this, because it's a little bit further north. But the first thing to do is to look out the window almost and look at the scenery here, and you can look at it and go, yeah, that ain't great, is it? It's the colour palette is wrong for me, the appearance is wrong, the trees are wrong, the actual plan form of the airport here, it doesn't look convincing. It's just bog standard default airport. Airport buildings don't look particularly great. I can tell you the hangars look nothing like this at all. They've got big sets of doors that slide all the way across. They're not white shutter doors like that. Just generally, it does not look like Coventry. It's got the right layout, but it does not look like Coventry at all. You know, there's much more down here in terms of general aviation. There's the air ambulance and all sorts. So, you know, I suppose you could turn around and say that it's got the right skeleton, it's got the right skeletal sort of frame and layout for it, but it doesn't look particularly great. So the first question is going to be, what will they have done to enhance that? The second question is obviously, what have they done to enhance that? Now, off the end of the runway here, there's an island here. It's not a junction, it's an island, and there's an awful lot of scenery around here that's quite significant. And this is a nice twisty little wooded road that goes down between various woods and whatnot. Really, really nice. Very nice. When I used to be able to ride motorbikes, I'd come up to the airfield using that route there. Very nice indeed. And then as you come around here on this airfield side, there's a huge industrial estate. Runs all the way around here, and British car auctions, I think it is, etc. There is a rail yard, but it's like a disused one, I think. More of a sort of... don't quite know why I'd have trains like that, but it's more of a sort of display one than anything else now. It's like a museum. But yeah, so that is absolutely dire, not at all convincing. Much better than X-Plane 10 in many respects, but actually not that convincing at all. So that's the first airfield we'll have a look at. What we'll do now is we'll just jump in the aircraft and go for a quick flight and see what the impression is. Okay, so let's get out of here then. Let's pop up here just quickly. It doesn't take long to start this thing, thankfully. Put some fuel on, make sure we've got the lights on. Can do without that sound, but that's fine, that's all good. That's all good for the minute. Down here, cancel that sound, make sure the fuel is on, which it is. Wind that up. Watching the temperatures as this thing starts up. Blades are turning. See if we can get this thing airborne without crashing everything. It really doesn't take long to get this thing started. If you want to fly helicopters, and I am absolutely appalling at it, then this is what you learn on. No question, this is what you learn on. So reset, pop that on, engine has to, avionics going on, don't want the heater, blah 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 blah, pitot heaters on, they're both on. We'll just pop those on a slight touch, pop pop pop, and that's going to be fairly good for the moment. What we can then do is we can then start to bring the power in. I say the power in, we're going to bring in the throttle. Look for the needles to stay matched as they increase. goes up quite quickly, and then it does stabilise quite safely within the green arc for both. Happy days. Turn that on. Everything else is on. Everything is good to go. Just going to ignore this check instrument. I'm not interested in that at the minute. We'll steady that, but I think this is knackered. Anyway, what we'll do is we'll get out of here and we'll have a look at what it looks like from the air, because actually that's what we're more interested in. I haven't flown this thing for bloody ages, so let's see how we get on then. Might do a couple of press-ups just to see how we get on. Normally I'm good for press-ups, which is the old... I haven't got my cyclic balance, my collective balance quite correct, so we'll do a bit of this, bit of that, bit of this. But what you'll find with helicopters, if you practice and practice and practice, and I haven't practiced nearly enough, what happens is you actually get to a position where the collective barely moves at all. Right, so looking over there, in real world terms, you don't see this miles of pasture with traffic and cars going across it. And I suppose this is the first thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to actually go against the flow of traffic, and we're going to go this way and see what it looks like accelerating out here. And it just looks like billiard ball green, featureless. It could just be a green desert. In fact, some deserts will have more features than that, but it just doesn't look appealing, inviting or interesting. The roads are awful. The textures and the shading and the colouring does not remind me of England at all. And as I say, this would be down here on the left would be a sort of nice little twisty country road. It goes off towards a couple of villages down here, and I have to say that it just doesn't give that impression at all. So without having to go into specifics, it's quite safe to say that at this sort of altitude, it's garbage. Absolute garbage. There is very little. I don't know what they're trying to do down there, but it doesn't ring any bells to me. In fact, what are they trying to do there? I don't know. But as you come down here, I'll deliberately fly out of balance so we can have a look. As you come down here, all of this down here is industrial estate. So it's got the airfield on one side with a few flying clubs, bits and bobs, and then on the other side it's got all industrial sort of units, etc. down here. And this is Coventry, so this is a major conurbation of Coventry, and it'd be interesting to see if they've got a decent representation of Coventry, because it's quite a big sprawling metropolis, really. But yeah, you can see the basic nature of this. Obviously, the next thing we'll have a look at in the video is what it looks like when this is a horrific island down here. This is the A45 island, and it's just horrendous. Although it doesn't have houses in the middle, so I'm quite impressed by that. But yeah, as a whole, it bears very little, if any, relationship to the real world, which is, I think, fundamentally what TrueEarth is all about. So back in Coventry now in TrueEarth England, and the first thing I'm going to point out is that TrueEarth England doesn't update the airports. And to be fair, there's no real need with things like the gateway available and the increasing number of payware airports that are becoming available for the UK. So between the gateway, payware, freeware, there's absolutely tons of airports out there. And I have to say that for £30, I think it would be potentially wishing a little bit too much to have every airport in the UK updated. What they have done, obviously, is the scenery itself. They've updated things like the 3D models, the shading, the colours, etc. So there's a marked difference. However, it's not in the airfields, because obviously that would be something where there's a certain amount of duplication in terms of them and the X-Plane 11 scenery gateway that keeps continually updating and upgrading airports, etc. So it's not something that I'm overly concerned about. As I say, I've still got the default airports for most airports anyway. I haven't got that much in the way of payware airports. But what we'll do is we will have a quick look around. So if I just press this, you can see we've got our default airfield. But what we do have is our photo scenery here. This is Baggington village, just to the around here, just to the south of north of Coventry Airport. And you can see that where I said about the industrial estate, we now have our industrial estate down here You can see the photo texture scenery still coming through here with some of the 2D sort of imagery. And the first thing I do note is that it's fairly fuzzy and grainy down low level. But there is an element of needing a balance in some respects between, if you like, the clarity and the pinpoint sharpness at low level and frame rate. And the other key thing is this takes up over 100 gig on your hard drive, just this one section of scenery. So if you imagine by the time that you get to England South, England North, Scotland, multiply it by 3, you know, you're at 300 to 400 gig on your hard drive, and you're starting to build up a vast amount. Now, a lot of people don't have huge amounts of hard drive space, so this is kind of making it accessible as well. Obviously, if you make your own, scenery from ortho and photos, you can choose the zoom level you want. But I understand that this is something that may be changing, and there will be areas where there's enhanced zoom levels, etc. There is also a service pack due out shortly that I think also changes some of the default scenery in London, where they've used a mix, because at the moment in London there's a mix of the default landmarks and newly introduced landmarks, and I think over the period of the service pack they're looking at altering that so that in effect it will all be new. But I stand to be corrected with that, but that's my understanding at the moment. So the airport is the same standard airport as we used to, but you can see underneath it's got the photo textures from TrueEarth, and it's all changed in regards to that. But for me that is a marked improvement, and then as we look out here we see a significant improvement as well. And if you remember, as I said, we had this road here where it's goes down to a tree lined wood. We've got the buildings and the houses here now all of a sudden, so what we'll do is we'll pop in and we'll see how we get on in terms of what it's like to fly around. And the key thing there is that it will give us an indication of, let me just get off the ground without crashing. It will give us an indication of what it looks like from the air. And visual scenery, VFR scenery, is designed really to be flown 2,000 to 2,500 feet upwards. So we will get up to that altitude. But what I want to do is, if you remember from the previous part of the video, there was a lot of this area out here was flat. Very, very flat indeed. And now, because of the terrain and the scenery itself, the autogen, you can see now what we've got is a combination of relief, we've got a combination of scenery, we've got cars that drive on the left hand side of the road, and all told it looks like a completely different part of the world in many respects. Now, as I say, the actual textures at this altitude aren't particularly great, but you do get a very good feel for what the scenery is capable of. And what we'll do is we'll just bring ourselves up. Got quite a low cloud base set now, and here we go. Let's have a look. That looks completely different to me. Looks completely stunning. There is a golf course down there. Water treatment works. Round to that side we've got some nice relief with the trees and the ground. We're not flying this particularly well, are we? That was almost an accident waiting to happen. So I have to say that that is a staggering improvement. As soon as you get to sort of 1,000 feet, all of a sudden it just changes completely. And you can see the difference. That's not the button I want. That's the button I want. You can see the difference, particularly now round to the south of Coventry. And now in terms of the roads as well, you can see down here the roads are blended much better than the default roads in terms of elevation. The default roads go off into their own little world on occasions. This is quite hard. I'm operating the mouse with the right hand and the stick in an unnatural sense with the left hand because I'm right-handed. But looking over here, you can see that Coventry is far better represented in terms of the area. Much more detail, far more buildings, and with the underlying photoreal textures, it does look good. As I say, once you get down to 500 feet or so, it's not so hot, but that's the sort of payoff that you have to put up with. And in fact, what we'll do is we'll just come round to the right a little bit more. And we can have a look at some of the buildings now, zoom in and have a look at Coventry. And it does look very, very good. As I say, you've got this this balance between the photorealistic textures and the 3D scenery. And there's the cloud. So let's get ourselves down. And what we'll do is we will move along to our next location, which we will have a look at in a moment. Okay, so here we are, Airfield Number Two, St Just, Land's End. We'll just pop outside, have a quick look. Now, this is, well, yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think I could do with my water textures fixing, really. But this is right on the south of the UK, right down at the end of the Cornish Peninsula. So this is the most westerly point in England. And it basically, somewhere over here is America. And again, default airfield. I mean, the layout's not too inaccurate. The layout exactly the same. If you like, the skeletal framework is exactly the same as Coventry. It's accurate. It's a decent rendition. But I'm just looking at this. This is dire. There is a sort of area where you go down around here. There's lots of coves down here at the end of the day, which are beautiful, absolutely beautiful. This is not beautiful. So what we'll do is we'll go out, we'll go over the cove, and we'll have a look around the coastline. And Cornwall is renowned for its sort of poledark cliffs coastline. I mean, this over here doesn't look particularly appetising at all. And it's got its very odd road network and how it works out. But we'll have a look over there, see what that looks like. So I won't bore you with starting the helicopter. I'll see you in a moment. Okay, same thing again. We're just going to get up, have a quick squiz around, and then, as I say, we'll go off and have a look around the coastline and see what the coastline looks like. And yeah, that looks absolutely nothing like Land's End. But then, what did we expect? This is the default scenery. I tell you what, in X-Plane 11 there are more airfields and airports than there are in X-Plane 10 that actually have buildings on. The number of times you'd fly in X-Plane 10 and you go somewhere where you didn't have scenery and there'd be just a strip of concrete with no buildings. So this time what we've got a little bit of relief now coming in, so we go off the end of the runway and we can see there's a dip with some trees. And I think it's safe to say that it just looks like we expected, really, not particularly great at all. So coming over here, we'll drop and have a look at the cliffs in a moment. And you know, you can quite happily say that it just looks like a pile of pants, really, doesn't it? That's not a particularly attractive view in terms of scenery. And then what you've got is this various sort of mottled colours that go absolutely billiard table flat straight towards a number of random buildings, trees, etc. Not a good representation at all. And although there is some relief and some terrain, if you had to do any form of navigation with reference to real charts and this, you'd really be struggling. It just doesn't look like the UK at all. Yeah. So that's, I'm not going to talk about that anymore. That's the bar set. It's not going to take much to beat it, but it'd be interesting. Right, we're back in the aircraft, so let's have a quick look around and spin and see what we can see. That was an awful takeoff into a hover. We're just going to depart any old how out to the west because we can. And immediately you can see the change in the terrain. Where we had a completely flat piece of terrain. We've now got terrain definition in terms of elevation, we've got trees, we've got scenery, we've got buildings, whole different world here. Now the other thing, if you remember when we flew over, we had an absolutely appalling, absolutely dire sort of cliff top appearance. Now Cornwall is full of little coves and cliff top areas and areas of interest, and that's a completely different looking sea line. I think it's coastline, I should say. I think you'll have to agree. And looking out to the right here, you can see that it's very, very different. The blending between the water and the cliffs is better, the appearance of the cliffs is better, and it just looks a whole lot more natural. It looks so much better than what we had before. So just looking out here, look at that. That's completely different. Absolute. It's just an amazing change. Very, very different. And as a result, you get a very different experience. Now obviously you haven't got much in the way of water, textures changed, but you can see that it's blended nicely with the coast where there's water masking, very nicely indeed. Coming around here you can see the little features like the church on the spit here. And we're now in a position where it could be used for visual navigation, because a lot of the features like the headlands etc. are now identifiable. And as we come back round, I'm going to head back towards the airfield for a specific reason. I mean, that is a completely different view. 100% improvement, absolutely no doubt about it. Looks completely different, looks more realistic. The colours over here, over the land, are so much better. There's the airfield. Right. Bit ham-fisted with the controls there. I am not the greatest helicopter pilot in terms of virtual aviation. Now I noticed something over here. If you remember, one of the things I was discussing is how it was sort of billiard table flat, and that's not how it is in real life. As we come lower here, you'll get to see that actually they've blended it with some of the default terrain quite well in terms of the elevations. So we'll see it in a second. Just want to slow down a little bit more. And you can see there, just coming into view, the drop off after the runway in terms of the terrain. So we're now below the runway elevation here, or level with it I should say. We can go below. So we're going down, 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 down. Can't see the runway. Below runway elevation here. Nice changes in terrain. You can see the trees, you've still got visual cues in terms of what's going on. And one of the key things to remember is that things like trees provide visual cues for all sorts of things. They do provide help in terms of speed. They certainly provide help in terms of distance, because you've then got a point where you can identify, you know, people know what an average tree height is. They might not be able to quote it as a figure, but they know from sight what it's like. So you can tell, you know, the proximity of things, whereas if you've just got a plain flat poorly textured area, you haven't got that same opportunity. So, you know, that gives us some impression as to where we are in relation to the ground. And one of the hardest places to fly is over water, because you have no visual references. You've got no frame of reference to tell you how high you are. So one of the things certainly with maritime aviation is historically there were always a lot of crashes in terms of aircraft crashing into the sea. So yeah, I mean, I have to say the overall improvement is very, very good. For me, things like the elevation changes make a huge difference, because, you know, we didn't have any elevation change of any significance in the default scenery. So does it make a difference? Oh yes, my word, it does. And The landmarks that you would expect to see are all there as well, or the key critical landmarks. So yeah, we're looking good here. We like this. Onwards and upwards. Now, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. This is Wolf Rock Lighthouse. Wolf Rock Lighthouse has a helipad at the top, not on the water. Has a helipad on the top for servicing the lighthouse. It used to be manned many moons ago, but it's not now, off the coast of Cornwall. So at the moment I would say that there's odd elements like this that are a little bit disappointing, because this is the kind of thing where you'd like to have a bit of a challenge. But yeah, unfortunately Wolf Rock Lighthouse, it's not accurate in having a helipad on top, which is unfortunate, because that's quite a nice challenge. I wonder, I hope somewhere there's some freeware scenery. I might go and dig that out one day just for the fun and the sport of it. But never mind, not everything's perfect, but we are having a good showing from ORBX so far. So this is our third and final location, so have a guess where we are. We're at London Heliport, and this is the Thames running down here, all the way off to City of London over here. But that is about as far from a vista of London as you can get. It depresses me in terms of the scenery. Absolutely awful. But yeah, never mind. What we'll do is we'll have a very quick flight just to see what it looks like from the air, and from that point on we will. I'm not quite sure you have a row of terrace houses or semis backing onto London Heliport. There's obviously an elevation issue, I think, here in terms of looking at this. Okay, so here we are again, London City Heliport, and we'll have a quick squiz around, see what we think. Key things are going to be things like the elevation, what the bridges are like, looking at the buildings, etc. But we're not going to hang around on the ground too much here. I'm going to do a rather unorthodox takeoff and just go over here. I'm sure they wouldn't be particularly happy with that in real life, and I'd probably get my licence torn up and thrown back at me. So, flying along the Thames, does it look like we're flying along the Thames? Nope, not at all, not even in the slightest. We'll get some speed going, so we're not dilly-dallying around here all day. So we're going to take a quick jaunt up the Thames for 2 or 3 minutes, see what we think. You can see the London Eye in the distance there. And yeah, I think it's safe to say that it's not going to be hard to beat it, really. I guess the best you can say about it is it's probably got all the roads and railways in approximately the right location off the road layouts, but actually in terms of does it look like London, no. I mean, compared to Sims of years ago, maybe it's better, but it doesn't really look that much to me. So I'm looking forward to seeing what TrueEarth will do with this. Here we are by the fabled London Eye, looking at some of the features around here to see what we can see. Houses of Parliament on our left, going past with a nice stately flag flying. Woohoo! Let's not crash into that, really, that's going to be expensive. Yeah, it's there's the gherkin. All the way down here. And you can see down here, it's just lost it completely, hasn't it? We're back into computer game world, really, with this. And I think the difficulty is it doesn't really matter what you do in terms of putting gherkins in places. Other than the feature, it's not really London you're flying over. You know, when you look at that, it's very much... That's not what you'd expect to see. And I'm no expert on London. Been there quite a few times. Well, many times. But that's not the kind of thing we would expect to see. So Tower Bridge, of course, there. And we'll leave it at that. What we'll do is we'll come back in a bit and we'll fly approximately the same sort of route. What I will do is at this point, this is a high density terrain, so there's lots of autogen etc. on this. And you can see we're pulling about 26, 27 frames per second, so that's our guidance for when we come back. See what we get out of that. So 25 to 26. As I say, I haven't got the most potent machine on Earth, so what we have to do is just see what happens when we change scenery. So just remember that. I suppose the lowest we've had is 24 to 25, but there or thereabouts. And obviously when we're in the more rural locations, we were getting sort of 45-ish, there or thereabouts. So okay, so London Heliport's changed a bit. The first thing is that we've got no fence here, and there's a reason I've paused this is because we've got an issue here. So it's not going to take long to see what the issue is. If I just do this, this and this, apparently helicopters can land on yeah, okay. That's unfortunate. London Heliport is one of the features I would have hoped would have been looked at. It is a key part of London is the fact that it has this heliport. There are other heli landing sites, obviously things like hospitals, etc. But this is a key thing for the business and economy of London, is it that it has this heliport. And unfortunately, there's been a clash in terms of elevations and textures. And I don't know why this is. I think this might be a one-off because everything else is really, really good in terms of its elevation and its terrain and the layering, etc. Now, as far as I can see, I've got the order right because everything else is fine. When it first fired up and first installed, it had the layers in the wrong order. It had them all over the place. So, you know, I was going to airports and buildings weren't there, or there was a mismatch in textures because it had some textures overlying other textures, and it was one of those things. It's a typical X-Plane thing where you need to go back in and readjust everything. And it, you know, that's normal. I think most X-Plane users become familiar with that slowly and steadily as a frustration of the sim. There are little things you can do. There's programs you can use and whatnot, but fundamentally, it's perfect in terms of its terrain and its elevation everywhere else. So I know there's no issue with the layering. So this is something where there's a clash, and I think maybe it needs to be revisited. Certainly, the helicopter landing sites pads overlying each other is completely wrong. Yeah, it's got the default buildings still in the right positions. So yeah, shame, but you can't have everything. Now, looking out the window, completely different view. I think you have to agree that looks a bit more like London. I have reduced the settings because for the last couple of TrueEarth videos, what I did was I was a bit naughty. I ramped up the scenery object density to max to see what impact it would have. And yeah, we had frame drops, but that was going to be a balance of TrueEarth and the amount of scenery. And actually, at Land's End, it made virtually no difference at all because there wasn't a great deal of 3D scenery and objects. So at Coventry, we saw a small drop. At Land's End, we saw no drop, really, no appreciable drop. Whereas here, obviously, at the moment we're at 30 frames per second, which is really good, but the actual sim's not running, it's paused. Now the first thing you can see as you look over here is there's a whole world of landmarks here in terms of London. And actually I think there's the BT Tower. As we scan around this way, what do we see? Anything else? Oh, there's Wembley over there, look. So yeah, there's a lot more detail added. There's a lot more in terms of what's gone on. A lot of it is still textured. I suspect this is not covered in buildings purely out of the fact that I haven't got the scenery set as high as I did have. Now, I've tried this flying around with the scenery object set to max, and I get about 22 to 23 frames per second, which sounds awful, but actually it's still quite fluid. So as a result of that, it's still not too bad to fly. So let's get this unpaused, and we'll take off and go and have a look. Yeah, hovering posts, not so great. Okay. Interesting differing watercolours. That bridge has changed. And the frame rate is holding at 25 to 26. This is one notch down from maximum object density. And as I say, I haven't got an amazing PC. My PC is okay, bit of a stutter there. But as we come round, we can see that actually, considering we're flying low over London, what we've got 20 to 25, the frame rates are just about holding. There's Battersea Power Station on the right as we come up to it. But we do have an awful lot more objects in here, so we're actually peaked at 26, 27 frames per second there, which is quite nice. And we have an enormous change in the amount of 3D scenery that's here, and also how it interacts with the textures in terms of the overlay. So very, very nice indeed. I do think it gives a greater sense of flying over a city. If I'm brutally honest, there's the Houses of Parliament and the London Eye. We'll go down a bit, go down by the Thames and see what sort of impact we get. Again, between 20 and 25. Try not to exceed VNE. Past the Houses of Parliament. And although the frames are down just between 20 and 25, which I would expect considering the complexity of the scenery, it's actually still fairly smooth. A little bit jerky on occasions, but certainly still flyable. Coming over towards the Shard, and I don't know what this building is. Don't know what the name of it is, but it had real issues apparently with the fact that because of this concave surface, it used to focus sunlight on places and cause real problems with heat and all sorts. So very bizarre. But as we come over here, you can see HMS Belfast moored here, Tower Bridge. Now, one of the things is that I believe they still use the default London landmarks and have added their own. But I think in Service Pack 1 that's changing. So yeah, it's got a very significant number of additional landmarks in London that you'd hope to see. So as coming back round towards the city, and although it's not entirely populated with buildings, there's lots of green open spaces, it still has the good visual effect of being London. Look at that bridge over in the distance. That's, you know, I don't know, is that the Dartford Bridge? I'm not familiar with that bridge, but I'm not familiar with this area at all, to be honest. But looking at the impact, very, very nice indeed. And we're still getting low 20s, so, but it's certainly flyable. It's certainly smooth enough for me. The number of times I fly into high density areas in terms of scenery is fairly limited. So for me, actually, the frame rate drop isn't that much of an issue, but I know for some people there's a critical importance in relation to it. As I say, my computer specs will be in the description so that you can have a look at them. I'm no computer whiz kid, so please don't ask me any questions about it. But there's the Millennium Dome. As we come around here, Thames barriers there, London City Airport's in front of us. This strange setup that's in London, this is a cable car that does exist in real life, and actually look, It's got cars on the cable car. Very impressive. And over towards London City Airport. And the whole thing is very, very nice. I have to say that the immersion factor of flying around here is great. So London, tick, happy with that. Particularly given the fact that it has sustained reasonable frame rates. We haven't lost massive amounts of frames, and even when we have, X-Plane 11 is managing to fly around relatively smoothly. I haven't got any jerkiness, I haven't got any issues with it. It just may be maybe a bit more fluid if we could get slightly higher frames, but that's more likely to be a system issue. The actual difference between the default scenery and this is not particularly great, which for me indicates that this is a useful product for most systems. Not every system is geared up with decent stuff. My system certainly isn't, but I think if you've got a really good system, ramping up the scenery to maximum isn't going to be an issue, certainly around the countryside areas, but even around cities it wouldn't be a particular issue. So if you're one of those lucky people who's looking at 1070 or 1080 graphics cards, then this could well be very nice for you. But even for me, I've got a 980 Ti, still very good, very nice, smooth, little lower than I'd have hoped for, but then I never got particularly great frame rates over London anyway with the default scenery, but this is much, much improved. Looking over there, that does look like a considerable city, and the impression of a density of 3D objects is very good. So I'm going to go to another location now, somewhere of interest that most people probably won't be familiar with, a place called Hucknall. And I'm going to go there for a very specific reason, and it's going to show the marked difference between the TrueEarth and the default scenery, and it is staggering. I'll be bluntly honest, it's staggering. So back in a moment. Okay, so this is Hucknall as the helicopter's just getting up to speed. I'll come up here. You can see this is clearly default terrain. Now we are literally just north of 53 degrees north, which is the northern limit of the scenery, so we're literally just north. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us for a very little flight. It'll take about 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll have a look at the boundary. And the boundary between TrueEarth and the rest of the UK is just gobsmacking. I'll be honest, it's somewhere over here. We're not going to look at it yet. What we'll do is we'll get airborne and we will discuss where we're at so far. Let's just turn ourselves on to south. So default scenery, what are we running? 30 frames per second because we've got lots of trees and we're low down. Head south. Put on lots of torque, probably going to end up exceeding the torque, and what we're going to do is a bit of a zoom climb. So yeah, this is the usual poxy rubbish sort of scenery that you get. Right, over there on the right you can see the 2 blocks. That I believe is the power station over at Ratcliffe. I'll just bring it round this way. Look at that. The difference there is just earth-shattering. Let's pause it, jump out, go up this way a little bit, get the helicopter out of the way. Look at the difference there. Now there's a problem with a join here. You see it's not quite lined up, which is a real shame. But you can see where the difference is in terms of masking and the roads and just it's a whole different ball game, even from this altitude. And I'm looking forwards to when they do England North, because the difference between that and that is just breathtaking. You know, this is down towards Nottingham way, and looking down here we've got Ratcliffe Power Station, Ratcliffe on Soar. This is Nottingham, I believe. And then just north of Nottingham we've got the airfield of Hucknall here, which is where we've just taken off from. Default scenery, wouldn't expect that to change at all, even when they do the northern half. However, the state of that compared to the state of that, that for me is the single biggest visual indication of what's going on. And for that alone, I think it's worth the £30. Right, let's sum up. In a built-up area, London didn't have a massive impact on frame rates, much less than I was expecting. Did have an impact, however, the density and the appearance of a dense city changed the look of London considerably. As I say, there's a couple of areas where it's a bit meh. One of which is the London Heliport, which I think is a real shame, because that is a significant part of London. And for helicopter simmers, that's a particularly significant thing, because that's, you know, a route in and out of London. And London has the heli lanes where you fly specific routes in and out of London Heliport, and also across the top of Heathrow and things like that. So that's a real shame. But other than that, London looks good, plenty of landmarks, plenty of elevation. It has an appearance of dense scenery, even if you don't have your scenery maxed all the way up. And I'd suggest if you fly around places like London, unless you've got a really powerful PC, that's probably not a beneficial thing to do. Going out to a more rural local airport, so that was Coventry. If you remember that we had very poor elevation around there, we had very poor consistency with tree lines, roads, etc. What we had there was obviously much improved elevation data, much improved trees, much improved 3D objects, obviously the change in colouring that's obvious from this image here, but a very marked difference. And also then what we got is features like the Tollbar Island and various things where we could actually navigate visually if we wanted to do so. And then the final one was, if you like, the most rural area, but it was Land's End. You saw the terrain elevation differences even off the end of the runway, which are nice to see. We saw a better coastline, better cliffs, and overall the impression there was much better. And then finally, two things. You saw Wolf Rock Lighthouse. Unfortunately, there's small things like that which would have been nice to have seen correctly modelled and not correctly modelled. Bit of a shame, but hopefully that kind of thing can be picked up for Service Pack 1. And then this single image demonstrates for me the biggest difference that you will see if you have this package on your computer. Now, I am going to add in a little caveat here. It's not perfect, and you can still see that there's an element of graininess to some of the ground textures, but there's a big balance here. So let me just see if I can, on my other screen, see how large the actual scenery is. So bear with me, feel free to talk amongst yourselves. Now the scenery is a package. Properties, it weighs in at 126 gig. So by the time you've done the 3 areas of the UK, South, North and Scotland, you're looking at just under 400 gig, most likely, there or thereabouts. That is an enormous amount of space if you don't have vast amounts of storage already on your computer. So I'm lucky that one of the things through flight simming is I've bought storage, so I have plenty of room, and herein lies a key thing. There are people out there who are quite happy to generate their own ortho terrain from satellite imagery, and they do it to a very high level of detail. They do it to like zoom level 17, zoom level 18, very, very fine detail, absolutely crisp images. They then do the various overlays for roads, etc. And they generate astoundingly detailed terrain that just looks absolutely stunning. But it comes at a cost, and it comes at the cost of two things. The first thing is the potential cost to the computer's performance. The second thing is the cost to your hard drive space. And whilst that route is free, it does take time, effort, a little bit of knowledge, and an awful lot of hard drive space if you want to do it to a decent level. So obviously there's a compromise somewhere between this garbage here and exceptional photorealistic scenery with overlays that people have generated themselves using software that's out there. You've got this, and this is where it becomes a bit of a balancing act. For me, the balancing act here is right for an average sim user. So for an average sim user, you're paying £30. You get a very marked change in the environment, the colours, the textures, the buildings. It's the right sort of buildings for this part of the world. You know, that's not UK. That's not UK at all. So for £30, is it worth it? I think the answer is yes. I think it's great personally. It's not without flaws. There's areas where it could be improved. You know, this is the standard with today. We are such picky consumers compared to where we were years ago, and we've got every right to be, because the tools are there and people are aware as customers of the tools that are there and what is achievable in these things nowadays. But I guess the key thing is you have to generate a balance between the cost, the time, what the benefits are for the user, and you know, there's a very big sort of mix of things going on here. But fundamentally for me, I think it's all awesome. I think it's a really, really good addition. It's really worthwhile. The difference is just mind-blowing. And actually, when I was flying around in it just before doing the second half of the videos, the ones with the various airfields, I almost became attuned to this, and I'd forgotten just how garbage this was. So it only takes a couple of hours to become completely immersed in this. And as I say, feature-wise it's correct. And going all the way back to the beginning, one of the biggest things for me is if you're going to generate photorealistic scenery or scenery with high definition in relation to the world around you, you have to be able to use it to actually fly a visual route that you would fly in a normal aircraft. And you have to be able to recognise features in roads, rivers, lakes, forests, woods, cities, coastline peninsulas, certain key landmarks, but obviously you don't tend to navigate too much by key landmarks. You might navigate by reference to, say, Ratcliffe Onsor Power Station over here, which, I mean, that's a long, long way away. And to have that sort of object spring up at that sort of distance, and it's a very accurate representation, it's a quite reasonable representation looking at it. And East Midlands Airport is over here somewhere, other side of the road, I believe, somewhere over here. But yeah, it's stunning, absolutely stunning, and I can think nothing more of it than that. And of course the other thing is that kind of level of detail, the range of that level of detail is the kind of thing that potentially users of FSX and P3D are potentially unfamiliar with, and still to be running 30 frames per second on my machine for me is quite decent. I'm quite happy with that. So hope that video is of use to you guys. Don't forget to like, share or subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and hopefully I'll speak to you soon. Take care.